Throughout history, artists have pursued the remarkable goal of creating the illusion of depth and three-dimensionality in their work, transforming flat two-dimensional canvases into vibrant three-dimensional masterpieces. In photography, this quest is no different. Creating a sense of depth in your photos can make them more engaging and lifelike, capturing the viewer's attention and drawing them into the scene. And so, in this video, we're going to be exploring the top 10 techniques that photographers can use to achieve stunning depth and 3D effects in their work. Let's get into it. Beginning with secret number 1, overlapping spatial layers. One of the fundamental principles of creating depth is the strategic placement of elements across different spatial layers. This means establishing a clear foreground, middle ground, and background, and then incorporating overlapping elements in each layer. This layering guides the viewer's gaze through the scene, inviting them to explore the various spatial planes. The crucial aspect of this technique is to overlap elements across different spatial layers. When one object blocks another, it indicates which object is closer and which is further away. Overlapping spatial layers, otherwise known as occlusion, is a depth cue that artists have used since ancient times, and has even been observed in early cave paintings and ancient Egyptian art. Similarly, photographers can harness this concept by strategically positioning objects or subjects in their compositions to create the same kind of overlapping layers. Whether it's a branch in the foreground or a person positioned in front of an expansive natural scene. Leveraging occlusion is a simple and easy way to add depth and visual interest to your photos, drawing viewers into the scene. Secrets number 2 and 3, linear and forced perspective, which has long been used in art history to convey depth and spatial relationships. This technique exploits the natural phenomena of objects appearing smaller as they recede into the distance. By strategically positioning objects of varying sizes and distances within your frame, artists and photographers can create the illusion of depth and distance, drawing the viewer's eye deeper into the scene. Note how objects that are smaller and further away are typically placed higher up in frame, while closer objects are positioned towards the bottom. In photography, this technique can be replicated by carefully choosing the placement and arrangement of elements within your composition to create a sense of perspective and distance. In the compositions of these two photos, for example, intentional placement of elements closer to the camera, such as the book and the model's hands, is used to create depth. By positioning these elements nearer to the camera, their size appears disproportionately enlarged compared to the subject. This is known as forced perspective. Similarly, objects further away in the background appear disproportionately smaller compared to the subject, creating a sense of depth between the foreground, middle ground, and background layers. This deliberate manipulation of size signals to the brain that there are objects positioned at varying distances from one another, enhancing the perception of depth in the composition. Next up, we have secret number 4. Atmospheric perspective and depth of field. Atmospheric perspective or aerial perspective is a technique that mimics the way our eyes perceive distant objects as being less sharp and defined due to atmospheric effects such as haze, humidity, or particles in the air. Throughout generations, artists have used techniques like sfumato to blur the edges and contours of objects, especially those in the background, to create a sense of atmospheric perspective and distance. This can be seen in paintings such as the Mona Lisa, as well as in Vermeer's Girl with a Pearl Earring, where the softening of the details in the background and along the subject's edge helps to draw attention to the Mona Lisa's face and the pearl earring, making them stand out more. In photography, achieving atmospheric perspective can be done by simply controlling the depth of field through aperture. By using a wider aperture, such as f1.4 or f2.8, photographers can selectively focus on the subject while allowing the background to become softly blurred. This not only mimics the effect of atmospheric perspective, where objects further away appear less sharp and distinct, but also the natural focusing and blurring of human vision. Depth of field further enhances the 3D effect in photography by increasing the perceived separation and distinction between different spatial layers in frame. effectively isolating the subject from both the background and foreground layers and making them stand out. You can take this depth of field concept to the next level by incorporating multiple elements or objects at increasing distances from your subject. This creates a gradual blurring effect, where objects that are just a little bit further away from your subject start to blur slightly, while those further still become even more blurred. This gradual blurring effect creates an illusion of depth that feels incredibly impactful, as if the viewer could just step inside the scene, making your image come alive in 3 dimensions. Secret number 5, leading lines like you've never seen them before. From the Renaissance period to modern times, artists have strategically used leading lines to direct attention and enhance the 3D look of their creations. By incorporating lines that lead toward the main subject or towards a vanishing point, artists can create a sense of movement and draw the viewer deeper into the scene, making the composition 10 times more engaging and dynamic. This technique can be seen in many masterpieces where artists cleverly use architectural elements, light direction, and natural lines within the environment to achieve a compelling visual flow. Leading lines are also a powerful tool for enhancing depth in photography, and there are typically 3 distinctive types of leading lines that one can use. Number 1 is guiding lines. This is the first and most common type of leading line that creates a sense of depth by drawing the viewer's eye into the frame and towards the main subject or focal point of your image. Number 2 is perspective or receding leading lines. A less commonly known type of leading line is one that guides the viewer's eyes from the foreground into the background of your photo, drawing them deeper into the frame. This enhances the perception of spatial layers, distance, and depth within your composition. These types of leading lines also enhance the linear perspective concept that we spoke about earlier, especially when they converge or lead toward a singular point, aka the vanishing point. Number 3 is radiating leading lines, which are essentially symmetrical leading lines that emanate outwards from the center of your image. They draw attention into your photo towards the main subject while also adding a sense of movement and energy, reminiscent of movement lines typically found in old comic books. Radiating leading lines can be found on paths, bridges, hallways, alleyways, and many other architectural features. Secret number 6, foreground-background contrast. Across the centuries, foreground-background contrast has been a prominent technique used to create depth and dimension in paintings. Artists have employed various methods to accentuate subjects in a brighter foreground against a contrasting darker backdrop, or the reverse, where darker tones are used in the foreground and contrasted against lighter backgrounds. This technique draws the viewer's attention to the main subject, making them pop out and appear more prominent. At the same time, this effect creates a visual separation between the foreground and background layers, reinforcing this sense of depth. The Mona Lisa is a classic example of this, where the subject is illuminated in soft, warm light against a relatively darker and cooler toned backdrop, creating a contrast that emphasizes the figure's 3-dimensionality. The good news is that achieving background-foreground contrast in photography is fairly straightforward. You can either control lighting conditions or make slight adjustments to your composition to easily take advantage of this effect. For example, you can use artificial lighting to illuminate your subject and then expose for your subject, which will create a relatively darker backdrop. If you don't have access to artificial light, you can simply position your subject in a brighter foreground against a naturally darker backdrop. You can find plenty of opportunities like this outdoors. You just need to keep your eyes open and know what you're looking for. Alternatively, you can always do the inverse to create more of a silhouette effect. Even if your subject wasn't captured against a darker background, you can still create a subtle foreground-background contrast during the editing process by making your subject brighter and the background darker. We'll delve into post-processing techniques for depth in secret number 10, but first, let's explore secret number 7, color and color temperature. Artists have long used color and color temperature to imbue their works with depth and dimensionality, skillfully curating the colors used in order to make certain objects look nearer or further away. One notable example of this is to use contrasting warmer and cooler tones. The interplay of warm and cool colors adds visual richness and depth to compositions, inviting viewers to immerse themselves in the created worlds. Another way artists create depth with color is by adjusting saturation levels, with more vibrant colors in the foreground and muted tones in the background. This technique mirrors the natural atmospheric effects seen in landscapes where distant objects appear more hazy, desaturated, and cooler in tone. Photographers can replicate these techniques by paying attention to color and temperature in their compositions. You can adjust things like the white balance in your camera settings to create warmer or cooler tones, as I teach in my portrait transformation course. Or you can use special handheld lighting to create warmer tones in the foreground, contrasting them with cooler tones in the background or in the shadows. Photographers can also create a color contrast in their work by directing subjects to wear warmer attire against a backdrop of cooler tones, creating a striking color pop. Even the warmth of your subject's skin tones against a cooler toned backdrop can foster a similar sense of depth. Similarly, positioning subjects next to warm-colored objects in the foreground, such as red flowers against a backdrop of cooler-toned elements, can amplify the visual impact and depth of an image. Next up, we have secret number 8, lighting techniques. Lighting and shadow created through the use of shading techniques has always been a go-to tool for artists aiming to add depth, shape, and dimension to their work. The technique of shading gradients, which can be found as early as the Stag Hunt around 300 BCE, aimed to enhance the perception of surface curvature and volume. Other examples include Caravaggio, Rembrandt, and Vermeer, who skillfully manipulated light and shadow to enhance the three-dimensional quality of their subjects. By incorporating shaded gradients into their work, they were able to sculpt form, emphasize texture, and imbue their compositions with a sense of shape and depth. Photographers, like painters, also harness the power of natural light to infuse depth and heightened realism into their images. One of the simplest yet most effective methods is to position your subject next to a window or a doorway, which can help to create beautiful contrasts of light and shadow, enhancing depth and 3D shape. Photographers can also leverage the changing qualities of natural light throughout the day. Early morning and late afternoon, known as the golden hours and pre-golden hours, offer soft, warm light incorporating flattering shadows, adding dimension to subjects. Similarly, shooting at around 10 AM or 3 PM can create flattering 45-degree lighting typically found in professional studios. Backlighting is another powerful technique where the subject is illuminated from behind, creating a halo effect that separates the subject from the background. This contrast makes the subject pop, adding a three-dimensional feel to your image. In my portrait transformation course, I delve much deeper into specific lighting techniques, including the strategic use of directional natural light, as well as the intentional absence of light. These methods can elevate your portrait photography, giving your photos a professional and cinematic feel. Secret number 9, poses for depth. So speaking of portrait photography, when aiming to add depth to your photos of people, mastering the art of posing is essential. Throughout history, artists have employed various types of poses, not only to capture the likeness of their subjects, but also to create a sense of shape and three-dimensionality in their portraits. By strategically positioning their subjects and incorporating subtle shifts in body orientation, artists were able to imbue their portraits with an elevated sense of depth. For example, painters often position their subjects turned slightly away from the viewer to accentuate the contours of the face and body, creating dynamic shadows and highlights that enhance the perception of depth. The same principle applies to photography with the use of the 45-degree turn pose, leaning against a wall pose, or the over-the-shoulder pose. Additionally, by combining certain poses with a low aperture setting such as f1.4 or f2, you can heighten the sense of depth in your images. For example, asking your model to lean forward can create a gradual blurring effect along their body and into the background, emphasizing the transition between multiple spatial layers in the composition. Another technique is to position yourself standing above the model, creating a gradual blur from the model's sharp and in-focus face along their body and into the ground. Extending your model's limbs towards the camera can also enhance depth in your portrait photos by creating a gradual blurring effect from your foreground towards your subject, emphasizing multiple layers of depth in the composition and creating a strong 3D pop effect. Secret number 10, editing techniques. In post-processing, photographers can enhance the illusion of depth through various editing techniques. Here are some of the methods that you can use. Number 1, selective focus. In Lightroom, you can now mimic the effect of shallow depth of field achieved using a low aperture lens. By blurring the background slightly, you can draw attention to the sharply focused subject, helping to draw emphasis to them while boosting the sense of depth. Number 2, selective brightening. This is all about adjusting the exposure selectively in different areas of your image in order to highlight key points of interest and make them pop. This can be done using tools like the linear gradient tool or the brush tool applied to your model's face. Next, we have subject background contrast enhancement. So speaking of using selective brightening, by using Lightroom's AI masking selection tools, you can now very easily enhance the subject background contrast we spoke about earlier by selectively increasing the brightness of your subject and reducing the brightness of your background. This allows you to make the foreground and background elements more distinct, enhancing the depth and making your subject stand out. Similarly, you can also add in a vignette to your image by either using the vignette tool or by adding in a radial gradient mask. A radial gradient gives you the added control to adjust things like color or contrast, which will help you to enhance the subject background separation and ultimately your photo's depth. Subject separation is at the heart of enhancing depth in your photos, and there are numerous ways to achieve this. For instance, you can add in cooler tones to the background or shadows, and warmer tones to your subject or the highlights, helping you to create results that look like this. Another trick you can do is to subtly desaturate the background colors while increasing the vibrancy of the colors in your subject, creating a more 3D color grade that pops. By mastering the art of depth and dimensionality in your photography, you can transform your images from flat representations into captivating and immersive masterpieces that captivate viewers and leave a lasting impression. Let me know which depth enhancement technique is your favorite in the comments below, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.